What's it like to be charged by a 450-pound gorilla? For that matter, what do you do when 9 tons of raging African elephant tries to tear you apart, along with your camera car? Just how close can you get to a man-eating shark and still expect to return home in one piece to tell about it? Few occupations in the world offer the variety of dangers, the elements of risk faced by the people who make movies about wild animals. Every assignment is liable to involve a potential threat to life and limb and entails fresh hazards, unknown circumstances, and brand new opportunities to get into serious trouble. Nature can be beautiful, it can be awe-inspiring, it can be magnificent, but it's just as liable to be treacherous as well. Somehow, in the midst of all the uncertainties and risks, the men and women who make these films send back some of the most riveting images ever seen on television. This is William Devane. In the next hour, we'll meet 3 of the most exciting people working in television today. We'll find out firsthand about the unpredictable and sometimes terrifying world of wild animals. We'll learn about some of their close calls and discover who it is out there that plays the most dangerous game. The year was 1975. Across the world, millions upon millions of viewers in almost every country on Earth sat transfixed before their television sets, watching one of the most awesome spectacles in the entire world of nature: the annual migration of the Serengeti wildebeest across the plains of Africa. Films like this go beyond language, beyond culture, beyond political creed. And viewers in Russia, China, and almost every non-aligned country in the world, as well as the Western nations, found themselves caught up in the heart-pounding excitement. The whole world shared an important learning experience. This extraordinary record was the work of a young man named Alan Root, who spent the better part of 3 years filming it at considerable risk and danger to himself. Today, Alan Root is 52 years old and still making wildlife movies in East Africa. He's a citizen of Kenya and lives just outside of Nairobi, so he doesn't have to go far to find the action. Alan finds it easy to relate to the animals of Africa, both to those he films and to those even closer to home.
People are always asking me things like, what's the most dangerous animal? They think I must be some sort of expert on that kind of danger. And they want to know things like, is a buffalo more dangerous than a rhino? I try to be polite, but there really isn't an answer to those kind of questions.
Alan bears the scars of quite a number of close encounters of the lethal kind. In the course of his career, he's lost a finger to a puff adder, been attacked by hippos, and bitten by a gorilla. He knows a lot about dangerous animals. Only he doesn't think there is such a thing.
In fact, animals are very seldom dangerous. Even the biggest of them will usually run away from a man, and that in itself is a sad comment on what a dangerous animal man is. But there can be dangerous situations. When you're working in very close with a potentially dangerous animal, you're walking a very fine line. And if something happens to upset that balance, you can be in trouble very quickly. I had a run-in with a hippo once, and it happened in exactly that way. We'd gone to a place called Mazima, a spring that is so clear that you can actually film the hippos underwater. Later, I started following them, getting a little closer each day. Underwater, they're almost weightless. So they look very much like men walking on the moon, or like the ballet dancers in Disney's Fantasia. After a couple of weeks, I was able to get close enough to film a fish that scrapes algae off the hippo's skin with their rasping mouths. The hippos knew I was there all right, but because I didn't make any threatening gestures, and because they have no enemies underwater, they tolerated me. Then one day we got one of those situations I've been talking about. Two males got into a fight and stirred up a thick cloud of silt, and in the confusion I was attacked. I kept filming until there was so much silt there was nothing else to film. And I only got bitten because the hippo bumped into me in the murk. Of course, there are some shots that you can only get by putting yourself into a dangerous situation. And when you have to do that, you try to minimize the risk by making sure that everyone involved knows exactly what they have to do. Of course, you can't tell the animals what you want them to do, so there's still a chance that something could go wrong.
Catching snakes is something Alan Root has been doing since he was a boy. The snake in question is a black-necked or spitting cobra. On this occasion, he was working with his wife, Joan. The black-necked cobra has a deadly bite, and it can also spit its venom up to 12 feet. The cobra aims for the eyes, causing pain or even temporary blindness. The spitting action lasts only a 20th of a second. Slow motion requires a high-speed camera. This one runs 10 times faster than normal. Because of the exposure speed, the lens is at full aperture, so focusing is critical. Also, the camera runs so fast you can run out of film before the action starts. Even a test uses up 15 feet. Lighting, too, is critical. The thin jet of venom will only show up when lit from behind against a dark background. These were all Alan's problems. Joan had only one problem. She was the target. The cobra will only spit at eyes, so Joan keeps just out of range while holding the snake's attention. It's the old Indian snake charmer's trick. If Joan moves back, the snake will turn and flee. If she moves too close, it will spit or attack. When Alan is ready, she will move in to make the snake spit. Too close. It tried to bite her. And now it turns on the camera. When the puff adder bit him years ago, Alan nearly died because he was allergic to the anti-venom. He cannot have the treatment again, so a bite from a cobra this big could well be fatal.
Facing the sun now.
Spectacles are enough to protect the eyes. If quickly washed off, the venom doesn't harm the skin. Alan Root recognizes the dangers inherent in his line of work, but he accepts them as a natural part of living and working in the African wilderness.
I grew up here in Africa, and from almost as early as I can remember, I wanted to be involved with wildlife in some way or other. I left school very early, so I wasn't able to get a job as a game warden at that age, and I wasn't very academic, so I wasn't going to go on to be a biologist or a vet or anything like that. And I did have a little 8mm camera. So I gave it a shot as a cameraman, and I'm still doing it today.
Alan's first major breakthrough took place in September 1962, when he and Joan went to Lake Mogati to do a story on the millions of flamingos nesting there. Halfway through the project, they found themselves in the middle of a natural history disaster.
Flamingos normally live in water that has a high soda content. But in the case of Lake Magadi, the concentration of soda was so high that as the chicks walked through the shallow water, it crystallized out around their legs and formed heavy anklets. Within days of hatching, tens of thousands of chicks were trapped in this way. For many, death followed. The midday temperature on the lake's surface rises to over 140 degrees. We began by rescuing as many of the chicks as possible by ourselves, but that was obviously a hopeless task. It was a unique situation, and at least in this case, man wasn't to blame. But man might actually help if we could organize a rescue. And it turned out we had the perfect way to get our message across. We had the films that we'd taken at Lake Magadi. So we got messages through to Nairobi and to the World Wildlife Fund, and we used the films we'd made to convince people just how serious the situation was. The Army and the Air Force sent equipment, freshwater tanks, and volunteer helpers. All told, over 30,000 chicks were physically freed from their leg shackles, and at least 100,000 other birds were prevented from going into that part of the lake where the soda concentration was highest, and so they too were saved. To be honest, it was a natural disaster, and if we hadn't been there, it would have gone on unseen and unrecorded. 130,000 chicks in a population of millions isn't very many, and within a couple of years the flamingos would have made up for that loss. What it did show was the importance of film as a way of getting across a wildlife message clearly and powerfully, and capturing the attention of the world.
Those were the comparatively early days of the conservation movement, but even then the Roots' little movie helped focus attention on the need to protect wildlife. In 1967, after Kenya became an independent nation, the government created a special national park for flamingos at Lake Nakuru. Today, as these scenes shot by Bob Campbell attest, they're flourishing there. It's one of the greatest bird shows on Earth.
You know, this business is really only as dangerous as you care to make it. You can make a perfectly good wildlife film through the windows of a Land Rover and never get into any kind of trouble. Or you can go looking for some different angles and turn life into quite an adventure. I guess I've gone looking for trouble on several occasions, and I can think of a couple involving the hot air balloons that we often use for photography. In the first case, we'd been blown off course and had come down in the forest high up on the Mara River. We had to load all our equipment into a rubber boat and make the journey back down the river. And because there would obviously be some excitement on the way, we got ready for filming. The buffalo was okay. I think the water was deep enough that there was no way he could have got to us. I figured our boat was big enough that we wouldn't have any trouble with the hippo. So in the narrow stretches, we just went straight through the middle of the schools. Then we spotted a mother elephant with her calf drinking on the bank. And again, I thought the boat was big enough that we wouldn't be attacked.
Around at the back, she's coming.
She could easily have killed us. With her small calf, she felt very vulnerable. So this was just her way of telling us to shove off.
God, look at those holes. punctured one of the rear tubes as well.
That's okay.
The other incident involving a balloon was our assault on Mount Kilimanjaro. It had never been done before. Kilimanjaro is the highest point in Africa. It meant we'd have to fly to well over 20,000 feet, which had seldom been done in a hot air balloon. We'd need special clothing and oxygen equipment. But because of our load limitations, we wouldn't be able to take parachutes. We were just going to have to put our necks on the line. We took off into a beautiful dawn. We were on our way, and now there was no turning back. It was like nothing I've experienced before. A slow-motion dance with the wind, 2 miles above the earth. The only thing keeping us up there was a beat-up wicker basket and a single gas burner. What with filming and flying, I had plenty to keep me busy, which is just as well. If I'd had time to think about the dangers, I certainly wouldn't have enjoyed that flight anything like so much. And then, 4 hours and 50 miles later, there it was, the extinct crater of Kilimanjaro. The difficulties and dangers gave an added kick to the pure exhilaration of the flight. I wouldn't have missed that trip for anything. For a balloon in Africa, it was the ultimate adventure.
From a balloon hanging over the heights of Kilimanjaro to a camera blind in the depths of tiger country in Nepal, wildlife filmmakers play the most dangerous game all across the world, as we'll see. A tiger is on the prowl in the Royal Chitwan National Park of Nepal. The gray langur monkeys sense the danger, and their every movement expresses naked terror. They scatter feverishly into the safety of the trees. From a hidden camera blind, cinematographer Dieter Plage senses a chance to capture a classic shot of animal predation. With high-speed film to overcome the shadows of the jungle and a slow-motion camera to record the action, Dieter is there when one unfortunate gray langur fails to make it to the treetops in time. These scenes, first shown in 1981, helped people understand the awesome power of wild tigers in an entirely new way. The fresh immediacy of Dieter Plage's camera work helped establish his film as a definitive work on tigers. Dieter Plage is a 52-year-old German married to an English wife, Mary. At present, they've set up camp in the Rocky Mountains, filming the animals of the Colorado River Basin. Over the past 25 years, Dieter has filmed wildlife all over the world, in Asia, Africa, and both North and South America, and can remember more than his share of close calls.
One time we were in Sri Lanka and we were trying to dart this one special elephant who had been so much trouble to the local farmers. For years he had been raiding their crops and they had been shooting at him with small guns, and naturally he had a terrible temper. Dr. Ian Hoffmeyer, the veterinarian, led us through the dense bushes and we could barely see. Every once in a while, we'd catch a glimpse of the old tusker. And then suddenly, without warning, he turned and smashed through the bushes right at me. His foot missed my chest by inches. It was the closest call I ever had. I guess that was dangerous, but my toughest assignment had to be the one with the gorillas. In the 70s, I heard about this amazing man called Adrian de Schrijver, who had dedicated his life to the care and preservation of mountain gorillas in Zaire. They are very rare animals, highly endangered, and so, of course, I wanted to film them. De Schrijver had been working with the gorillas for 4 years, and he had found that if he behaved the way they did, and even pretended to eat the same food, they seemed to accept him as another gorilla. A huge silverback male was the leader of the family he was studying, and Adrian called him Casimir. Every once in a while, Casimir would come charging down on him in a threat display. It was all bluff, but it was truly terrifying, I can tell you. Adrian learned that the way to deal with the threat charges was to remain absolutely stock still and stand your ground. So I tried to get to know Adrian. He was probably the bravest, most extraordinary man I ever met. He was very quiet, very withdrawn, and when I met him I figured I'd never get to know him. But I wanted to film those gorillas. So me and Lee Lyon, who was my assistant at the time, worked with him for several weeks, and Adrian realized we were serious about making a film. So finally, he took us into the forest and showed us the gorillas. Come. We were charged many times, and it was no picnic. I think if I'd flinched even once, Adrian would have said to himself, well, obviously, this is not the right man to make this film. Adrian had adopted a baby female gorilla whose mother had been killed by poachers. Adrian's children loved her, but the time came when Julie, as they called her, had to be returned to the wild. Adrian spent several weeks getting her used to the sights and sounds of the forest.
Oh là là.
In the wild, she had to be able to feed herself. So he introduced her to different food plants to prepare her for a life in the forest. Then, one day, he took her for the first time within sight and sound of Casimir's family. What happened next was totally unplanned. Suddenly, Julie made a sound we never heard her make before, and it was immediately answered by a wild gorilla in the forest. In minutes, we were surrounded by Casimir's family. The first gorilla on the scene was Casimir's son, who looked suspicious. And then all hell broke loose.
Casimir, du calme. Attention, Casimir, du calme, Casimir. Casimir.
Casimir's charge forced Adrian to drop the baby, which he never intended to do. If he hadn't, we were both convinced Casimir would have killed him, and maybe us, because Lee and I stood right next to him. Casimir took Julie with him to an open space, so I was able to keep on filming. My whole body was shaking, but luckily I'd put the camera on a tripod, so I was able to keep it steady. We had the laboratory step print the whole shot to slow down the action. You can see that Casimir never takes his eyes off Adrian, even when he reaches down for Julie. It was as if he suddenly realized that Adrian was some kind of alien, someone who wasn't one of them. Sadly, due to a spell of wet, cold weather, Julie died 10 days later. But at least Adrian had proved that wild gorillas will adopt a strange youngster. A year later, Adrian wrote to tell me that Casimir had died and that a new young male had taken over the group. He called him Dieter, after me, and I felt deeply honored. One of my favorite sequences was pure accident. I was in Sri Lanka when this big leopard decided to go hunting. He spotted a group of wild boar with their young, and I guess the leopard decided he'd like a couple of tender young piglets for lunch. Anyway, what happened next must have been as big a surprise to the leopard as it was to me. Once again, we got the labs to slow down the action, and you could see that those wild boars seemed to have the upper hand right from the start.
The boars moved in like tackles in a football game, each one in turn taking a shot at the ball carrier. The leopard had no option but to run for it, and even then the boars turned out to be surprisingly quick on their feet. They finally nail him. For one moment they managed to have him flat on his back and at their mercy, but somehow he was able to make his escape.
They even broke the poor guy's tail. And then there's the business of flying. I do a lot of my own flying, little microlights these days. It helps you to get wildlife stories you can't get from the ground. But when I first went to Asia in 1975, I was still taking lessons, and before I knew it, I had to fly into this little postage stamp airport in Nepal, and I mean there was no room for error. Well, I managed it okay, but there I was in the middle of the Himalayas, and of course I wanted to fly over Mount Everest. So I ran into this American pilot called Jay Klinkingbeard, and he told me about an airstrip 12,000 feet high called Changboche. And he said, man, landing at Changboche is like parking your car in a garage at 80 miles an hour. And he was not kidding. I have seen tablecloth which seemed bigger than that landing strip. All I could think of as I made my approach was that if I made any mistakes at all, that would be it.
After landing over 2 miles above sea level, Dieter was eager to go the extra 4 miles to reach the top of Everest.
Then I remembered something else Jay Klinkenbeard told me. When you fly in the Himalayas, you just don't fly through them clouds, because some of them clouds got rocks in them. The conditions were perfect, and the view was magnificent. But until you fly solo through the Himalayas in a single-engined plane, you don't really know what it is to be alone. There's no life anywhere in sight. Not a bird, not a tree, not a blade of grass. If you crashed in this part of the world, you would have no chance of survival. I reached 26,600 feet, and my oxygen needle vacillated. I decided to call it a day. I expected I could try for Everest another time, but the conditions were never right after that. Still, it was a great flight, and I've been lucky enough to see one of the truly wild places on Earth in a way that very few other people have.
As we'll see in a moment, the most dangerous place on Earth may well be below sea level. There's an old saying among wildlife cameramen: you can't tell the actors what to do. You must wait for the animals to do what they want to do when they're ready to do it. That's why wildlife cinematographers are a breed apart. To honor this select breed of artists, we've brought together just a few of the great moments of wildlife filming, captured by the men and women working with one of the world's leading companies specializing in natural history, Survival Anglia Limited. These are snow geese, uncounted millions of them pouring down from Canada into the Central Flyway. Snow geese flying south across the plains toward their winter home in Texas. These astonishing close-ups are the culmination of over 2 years of work by the Australian team of Des and Jen Bartlett. An African eagle collects its lunch, filmed by Tony Bomford. In time-lapse photography, Oxford Scientific Films catches a spider showing off its engineering skills. A desperately hungry lioness caught by Des Bartlett fails to catch a meal. Cindy Buxton shows us a parade of rockhopper penguins hopping on the rocks of the Falkland Islands. Joel Bennett catches the largest of all the land-based carnivores as it skates gracefully across the polar ice cap. Dieter Plage captures the entire problem of endangered wildlife in one frame, as a magnificent full-grown orangutan confronts the workmen who are cutting down its rainforest habitat. Once more from Des and Jen Bartlett, a young lion moves in on a herd of zebra and singles out a victim. A sloth in a Latin American rainforest falls victim to a harpy eagle, filmed by Neil Reddick. In Africa, scientist Ian Douglas Hamilton has tranquilized an elephant and now must inject the antidote. But a powerful matriarch has grown suspicious and won't let Douglas Hamilton approach. Desperate now because the drugged elephant is in danger, Ian decides to get to the victim in a Land Rover. The scheme works, but the matriarch is determined to stand her ground. In the end, it's no contest. The matriarch returns to the forest, but the Land Rover is totaled. Sometimes it seems that all the big, fierce, wild animals of this world can only be found hundreds of miles away from civilization. But what we sometimes forget is the fact that some of the biggest predators spend their lives only a stone's throw from human habitation. They are the ones that lie hidden in the seas around us. This blue shark was filmed by Stan Waterman, just off the coast of San Diego. But before viewers in Southern California start getting anxious about swimming, don't worry, you can relax. Blue sharks may look frightening, but they're too small and timid to attack humans. Even though these sharks aren't a great danger, don't ever try to do anything like this yourself. These men are professionals. They know exactly what they're doing. If you tried this yourself, you might find the sharks continue to nibble right up to your elbow and beyond. On the far side of the Pacific, a long way from San Diego, Ron and Valerie Taylor filmed the really dangerous member of the shark family, the great white. This may be the most predictably dangerous animal on Earth and deserves a wide berth. This is the terrifying killer that Peter Benchley frightened us with in the novel and later the feature film, Jaws. The best you can say for this one is, keep away. Jeff Foote is a 45-year-old native Californian who now lives in Jackson, Wyoming. He's been filming in and around the Pacific for over 15 years. He was originally trained as a biologist and approaches his work as a cameraman with scientific precision. Over the years, Jeff's made films about sea otters, salmon, elk, swans, and coyotes, among others. And we talked to him about his recent television special on killer whales.
Back in the late 60s, I was studying marine biology, but I decided to leave biology to make films on marine animals and other animals because I felt I could do more for the animals exposing them to the public than I could by doing research. Killer whales are wonderful. They're very intelligent. No threat to human beings in or out of the water. The only problem I had with filming killer whales was to make sure I was in the right place at the right time to film their behavior. At certain times of the year on the Patagonian coast of Argentina, Killer whales have been known to come right up on the beach to prey on marine mammals. Of course, I wanted to get this on film, but there were problems. First, would they even come around this year? And would it be when I was there? I was in Patagonia for a total of 9 weeks, and in that time, I only saw killer whales on 8 days. The older seals were aware of the danger, but the younger ones hadn't learned yet. And then, all of a sudden, there he was, a big male, 27 feet of killer whale, right up on the beach. After all that waiting, it was over so fast, I could hardly believe it. Before I left biology to film, I'd been doing research with sea otters. So there was little choice for my first film. It had to be sea otters, and I think to this day it remains my favorite film. Sea otters live along the coast of California, south of San Francisco. Back in the late 30s, everyone thought they were extinct until workmen on this bridge spotted some heads bobbing in the water. They were watching sea otters. They were killed off by the fur trade of the last century. Sea otters have the richest, densest fur in the world, making it the most valuable. So they were hunted and killed by the thousands to make fancy coats and hats. Today, there are about 1,600 California sea otters. Slowly, they're making a comeback. They're good swimmers, but you'd expect that. Some spend their entire lives in the water. They eat abalone, which they hammer off the rocks. Until I shot this scene, nobody was sure how sea otters were actually getting the abalone off the rocks. They float on their back, balancing a stone on their chest. They break open their shellfish on it. There are only 6 or 7 other animals that use tools, and that's including man. Sea otters live among the kelp beds offshore, where they find the food they need. The point I was trying to make in the film was how important it is to protect the kelp beds. If the sea otter's habitat goes, they'll go with it. But that's the key to a lot of wildlife preservation. You have to protect the animals, but equally important, you have to protect their habitat at the same time.
No collection of great wildlife scenes would be complete without a sequence on the largest animals that have ever lived on this planet, the great whales. No other animal on Earth seems to stir such sympathy, compassion, and even passion in the human mind as these huge leviathans. These are humpback whales, filmed by Al Giddings in the clear waters off of Maui in Hawaii. This is the species that's sometimes known as the singing whale because of its weird, haunting call, which can be heard for miles, some say for hundreds of miles beneath the surface. Later that same year, the film crew headed north to Glacier Bay in Alaska, the humpback's feeding grounds. It was here that Giddings recorded unforgettable scenes of the humpbacks feeding on tiny shrimp-like krill, which they swallow by the ton. In a remarkable behavior called bubble netting, the whales spiral up from deep below the surface, blowing a circle of extremely noisy bubbles. This concentrates the krill in the center of the ring. The humpback then surfaces in the middle and scoops the krill up, along with hundreds of gallons of water. Whales, of course, are highly endangered. People have hunted them for centuries for their oil and byproducts. But now that modern technology has developed substitutes that make whaling unnecessary, we still have a chance to bring these magnificent monsters back from extinction. In the last hour, we've met some extraordinary people and seen the dangerous game they sometimes play. We wanted to find one final image that might sum up the vision they share. We've selected this remarkable scene, shot a couple of years ago at the Kennedy Space Center by Mike Price. In the foreground, a family of ospreys busily feeds its young. In the distance, a space shuttle, symbolizing humanity's determination to confront the unknown, powers its way upwards in a new and ever more dangerous game. On the nest, the ospreys pay no attention. They're responding to an older and simpler imperative: to preserve and foster life on this earth. Let's hope that these two monumental forces captured in this one simple scene can continue to coexist. This is William Devane. Good night.
The open road leads to the best of the West.
Oh, my!
Grand adventures, wildlife, characters, and the best food and wine to be found.
I'm Doug McConnell. Join me on my travels along the open road.
Coming up next,